Usually it's on
Well,
the computer.
okay. Well, I'm recording right because it said either recording to this computer, my computer, or recording to the cloud.
Yeah, it looks like it's working out. Thank you, Paul, for setting it up. And shall we get started then, since we're live?
Okay.
Amazing. So welcome to another interview from the Oikos camp here in Barcelona. I have the great pleasure of introducing Paul Gower to be our speaker for the day. Paul and I met at the Institute for Social Banking's summer camp earlier this summer, and I was really impressed with the information he had to share. And since we're creating a toolkit for students to learn more about sustainable finance, I thought it would be great for Paul to bring some of his research, because he's a senior teaching fellow at the University of Warwick, and has over 45 years in experience in the financial sector directly. So we get both the researcher and academic perspective and the real world practical sense. So it's a really good opportunity with the many roles that you've had. So Paul, tell us who you are and what you do, and what can you teach us? Right.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me into this, Stephen. I'll try and keep my initial comments brief, but as Stephen said, I'm a senior teaching fellow at the University of Warwick in the UK, which, for those who don't know it, is, I guess, one of the top 10 universities in the UK and has a very strong international reputation. I'm an economist by training. I worked for many years in London in the financial sector, in both investment management and investment banking. I then went back to university and did postgraduate work in economics. Before becoming an academic, I worked as a financial sector regulator in the UK for a few years. I was a government advisor for a couple of years on secondment from the regulator. I've also been a consultant economist as well, working across a range of issues connected to the financial sector. And so, as he said, it's 45 years in and around the financial sector, mostly on what might be called the dark side of finance. But more recently, in the last, I suppose, 10, 12 years, I've begun to focus more on social finance, social banking, and I'm an associate of the Institute for Social Banking, whose summer school Stephen alluded to there, and that's where we both met. And I've presented at that summer school for 5 years now, I guess. And what I do there is to look at some of the current research in the area of social banking and social finance. And what I wanted to talk about today, though, was something slightly different, but hopefully interesting. And that's why we actually need a research agenda in social finance or sustainable finance, and in particular an academic research agenda, and some of the areas that might be of interest, and also some of the problems that can emerge and some of the barriers to developing this research agenda or this evidence base. And I think it's important to consider that. And I guess my starting point would be that there is a lot more research being undertaken on sustainable finance, more generally, social finance, social banking, whatever we want to call it. However, there are question marks about the quality of a lot of this research and the rigor of a lot of this research, unfortunately. A lot of the research that's being undertaken is actually being undertaken by consultancies and interest groups. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself, but unfortunately, a lot of the work that they're doing is merely designed to further their own agenda. And I think that's something that you've all got to be aware of with sustainable finance research. Look at who's producing it. What's their agenda? Why are they actually doing this research? Just to give you one small example, a report came out at the end of last year, October last year, by a couple of consultancies which claim that there was a clear link between diversity on company boards, climate action on climate change, and also remuneration, director remuneration based on climate change measures. And what they argued was that the more diversity you had on a company board, the more remuneration of executives was tied into climate action measures, the more climate action you would see on the part of that company. Unfortunately, the report they published showed nothing of the kind. Their conclusion was that it did, but it didn't. They showed some very, very loose correlations between these three indicators, but they didn't actually show any causality. And in fact, there could have been other factors which affected the climate action undertaken by these companies, for instance, regulation or the particular geographical region they were in. And again, regulation in that particular geographical area might have forced them into either more diversity at board level or more action on climate. And so there wasn't any causality, even though the report claimed there was. And there wasn't enough information in the report. They didn't say what their sample was. They merely talked about 150 companies across, I think it was 15 sectors, 6 regions. But again, there was no further information on who the companies were, what sectors they were in, and so on. It was poor, very poor practice. But it got quite a lot of publicity. And but that kind of research is very easy to attack. And that's the danger, because then the kind of story is that there's a fundamental weakness, there are problems, there isn't a relationship between diversity and climate action on the part of companies. And so I think this poorly written research can actually do great harm to the whole sustainable finance research agenda. I think there is a need for more academic research in sustainable finance, but again, there's a problem here. And the problem is that it's very hard to get academic research published in the so-called top journals if you're working in this area. And there are various reasons for this. I think, I'm not sure whether you're all aware of a paper that came out, I think 2 years ago now, by George Akerlof. Hopefully you've heard of George Akerlof. George Akerlof, winner of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics a number of years ago. Most famous economics paper is The Market for Lemons, which looked at asymmetric information and its impact. I have a lot of time for George Akerlof. He's a very interesting character, has done some really interesting work. He's in his 80s now. He's still at Georgetown University. And interestingly enough, his son, Robert Akerlof, is at Warwick University. He's an associate professor here with us. And George Akerlof wrote a paper called The Sins of Omission and the Practice of Economics. And I would strongly recommend that, it's very easy to read, I'd strongly recommend you read this, The Sins of Omission and Practice of Economics. And what Akerlof said in that paper was that there are kind of 2 approaches to economics, what he calls the hard approach and the soft approach. And he said the hard approach uses a lot of maths. It's very much based on big data sets, a lot of quantitative analysis. The soft approach doesn't. The soft approach, for instance, looks at narratives, stories, and more qualitative evidence. He said the problem with this is that it's the hard approach to economics, or what is perceived as the hard approach, which gets published. So if you look at the top 5 economics journals, which are of course all American, to get into those, you've pretty much got to publish hard economics, a lot of maths in it, a lot of quantitative evidence, a lot of data in there. But he says that this can actually lead economists to miss a lot of issues that do need to be looked at. And I mean, he goes through a number of these in this paper. Things like the causes of the financial crisis, which he said was missed by a lot of economists because it didn't really, looking at the macroeconomic situation before the crisis, wouldn't really, from a hard point of view, wouldn't really have shown you that there was going to be a crisis. He said it needed, real estate experts, finance experts, and economists to come together before the crisis to do some proper analysis, which may not necessarily have been hard in his definition analysis. Now, okay, so it's difficult to get published. That has a knock-on effect, because if you're a young academic trying to create a career, particularly in America, but also in the UK as well, you need to get published in the so-called top journals. So if you're trying to make a career as an economics professor, then early in your career, to get tenure, to get a permanent position, you need to be published in top journals. And unfortunately, you're not going to do that unless you do this, what Akerlof calls hard economics. So I think this can create problems. And he goes into some of the implications. He said what happens is that a lot of the economic research that's undertaken is hard, theoretically maybe sound, but actually, is it really important? No, it doesn't consider important issues. And I think that's also been, I guess, true with a lot of the research in sustainable finance or social finance, where economists and finance academics have got involved with it. Although it is obviously important, but at the same time, because of a lack of available data, or the fact that you simply can't quantitatively analyze, for instance, let's say sustainability, or it's difficult to, then it doesn't get published. So you see this in the whole debate around ESG metrics, for instance, and can we create better ESG metrics? Maybe we're looking at the wrong thing. Maybe it's something that we can't measure. We may be able to assess rather than measure, but if we assess sustainability or assess ESG, then we're bringing in qualitative issues which may not get us a publication in a top journal. So I think these are some of the kind of barriers and issues that researchers face. We're also, as we see more and more research being published in, let's say, not the top 5 journals, unfortunately, because a number of the journals that are publishing research don't have the same rigorous editorial process, a lot of the research that's getting through is not necessarily valid or sufficiently rigorous and can be attacked very easily. There's one journal called Sustainability, which has become a bit notorious, I'm afraid, for publishing pretty much anything on sustainability related issues without proper editorial judgment being taken on a lot of these papers. A lot of the papers that are published have very small data sets. They're not, you can't replicate them. Methodologically, they're unsound. They fall into the same trap as that consultancy report I mentioned, mixing up correlation and causality and so on. So we have to be a little bit careful with what we're looking at. And I think as researchers or anybody who's interested in sustainable finance, this is a point I made at the summer school that Stephen alluded to, we have to be careful of confirmation bias. So we have to look for evidence even when it contradicts what we think or what we believe in. And I think otherwise we just end up searching for evidence which may not be rigorous, may not be valid, but you still trying to use that to support our views and to support our beliefs. So I think there are a number of areas which warrant further research in sustainable finance, social finance. The kind of areas I suppose I would be looking at, and this is something I'm becoming interested in recently, is the idea of stories and narrative around sustainability, sustainable finance, social finance, and the implications of the prevailing story, particularly for finance. And this body of research, which is very small, I have to say, comes out of work done by Robert Shiller, another Nobel Prize winning economist. Robert Shiller in the last few years has looked a lot more at what he calls narrative economics. He's even written a book on it a couple of years ago. And what he's looking at is the role of stories, the role of narratives in determining economic behavior or determining behavior more generally. And it's interesting work. So what is the prevailing narrative in sustainability? How is that impacting? What's the prevailing narrative in sustainable finance? I.e., is it that ESG investing is more profitable, for instance? Is this what is leading, or what is leading to greater investment in ESG? So I think there's I think there is a role to play here. I think there's an interesting body of research, which is really in its infancy, and just looking at the sort of language that's used. And again, I think this is something that we need to look at. The point was this was raised a number of years ago now by a banker working for Triodos Bank, who read out a statement at one of the Institute for Social Banking summer schools. This is going back 4 or 5 years. And he said, I want to read you a statement from a set of a bank report and accounts. And he read it out, and it was all about the green issues they were dealing with, the sustainable finance issues they were dealing with, how they were promoting sustainability, etc., etc. And he said, that could well have been written by us, Triodos Bank, but he said it wasn't. It was coming from Goldman Sachs. And he said it was in their annual report. And he said, you look at Citigroup, you see the same. And he said, this is a kind of narrative that's becoming popular now. But of course, a number of these banks, as we've seen in recent years, have been found, let's say, guilty of greenwashing. So therefore, this prevailing narrative is being tainted by the actions of some of these banks. Now, what's the impact of that on the narrative? Does it make people more or less keen, if you like, on sustainable finance, or more attuned to sustainable finance? Does it detract from the message that needs to be got across? I think there's a whole set of issues around E, S, and G. And I guess one of my big things I'm interested in is the relationship between the E bit, the S bit, and the G bit. We focus on environmental factors a lot. Sometimes there's a focus on social factors. What's the possible trade-off between them? Is there a trade-off between them? What's the relationship between them? What about the G factors? What about the governance factors? I used to work in governance research. I mean, for, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 years, I suppose I've been involved with governance related research. A lot of when I was working in government, that was all about corporate governance. But often the governance aspect of ESG is forgotten about. How willing are we to accept companies or organizations which might have strong environmental credentials, but have weak governance? So again, there might be trade-offs there. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, is really looking at these links and these trade-offs within ESG, apart from, I know the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics in the UK has done some work on what it calls just transition, which does try and link social aspects into environmental. So what is the social impact of more environmental measures? And again, a lot of that is going to be qualitative. It's not necessarily quantitative. I think was also another interesting area of research, and I'm conscious of time. I'm very conscious of time. I'm sorry, Stephen knows I do tend to go on a bit once I get talking. 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes is never enough. One other area, just before I finish then, that I think is worth looking at is the relationship between, I guess, the story or the narrative that an organization is telling and motivation of employees. So are people who go to work what is the motivation for going to work for a graduate for a particular company? Are graduates going to work for companies because this company is giving them a strong, sustainable narrative or story? Is that the reason they're going there? If that is the reason they go to work for this company, what happens then? Do they become disappointed? I've spoken to a lot of people who work in social banks over the years. Many of these people have gone there because they think that the bank's values match their values. The narrative that the bank is telling matches the story they want to hear. It's one that appeals to them. But at the same time, when they get into the bank, the reality isn't necessarily what they expected it to be. And this is, I think, is an area for research, looking at some of these social finance organizations. Why is it that people go to work for them? The sustainable finance organizations, the social banks, what's the motivation there? And as an aside to that, what is interesting is that Robert Akerlof, George Akerlof's son at Warwick, has just got a paper which will be published soon, I think, in the American Economic Review, looking at narratives and stories and the motive and how companies use these to motivate workers. Interestingly enough, it's what his father would call hard economics, because it's full of maths. It's a theoretical model that he and other authors have developed. But I think it's it's an interesting idea. How do you motivate workers using a sustainable finance story? So I think there are quite a lot of issues there. One final one, just before I go, regulation. What is the role of regulation in sustainable finance? Should regulation change to either encourage or reward sustainable finance? If so, how? What should the mandate of a central bank be with regard to sustainable finance? Should it include sustainability issues in its mandate or not? And I think, again, these are areas that need to be researched. And I'll end there, because that's quite a lot. I think there are some exciting areas. I think it's going to be exciting. But as I said, I'd say to anybody who's going to get involved in sustainable finance, sustainable economics, social finance, and so on, just be careful. Yes, attack traditional orthodox economics for the weaknesses that it shows and it exhibits, but at the same time, make sure you don't leave yourselves open to criticism. Be just as rigorous in your assessment of your own research and the research produced by your peers in the heterodox economics movement. Beware of confirmation bias. There you are. How about that? Quick run through a few things.
Yeah, you went through a bunch of really big things, and we're definitely thinking a lot right now about that motivation piece of how do we motivate students to go further in this space. And I think that's pretty cool that you brought up all of these issues within economics, since we're a group that's also very focused on economics.
And I think also, I think also, can I just say that I know you're focused on economics, but another aspect of all of this is to bring in cross-disciplinary research to this, because this is something else that George Akerlof mentions. He says economists think we're at the top of the, I suppose, social science tree in terms of the rigor of our research. We like to think we're up there, and that anthropologists and sociologists are a bit lower, well, quite a bit lower down, actually. Historians don't even appear. But actually, there is a need. We shouldn't think like that at all. And there is a need to look at some of the way that other disciplines approach research, they undertake their research, and use that in our methodologies. So a lot of the narrative stuff, the textual analysis of texts, which I've done some research in that before now, that's been used in history in anthropology for many, many years. But text analysis, tiny part of economics research. So yeah, cross-disciplinary is brilliant.
Amazing. Francois, if you have a question, feel free to join us. And we have one question from Yulia, who's joined me here in the room. So I'll let her come in front of the camera and share what she has to say.
Hi again.
Hi.
Thinking about cross-disciplinary, I'm also involved in politics now, so I really resonate with that explanation and the way of solving things. Also, it's a bit about my question as well. You said regulations on the market, but we have to focus. We have to get people motivated in the sustainable finance as well. Which comes first? Do we regulate the market first, or do we get people involved first, then regulate the market? Because it's also politics and economics, and I'm an economic graduate doing politics, and I'm really interested in this because we have to have a roadmap, but we only have 2 roads. Which one to take first?
That's a brilliant question. I could probably take another half an hour to answer that, unfortunately, but I don't have that time. I think, okay, you can't divorce regulation from politics, and then you can't divorce politics from, I suppose, political debate and political engagement. So if you want to, I suppose, if you want to regulate, then that's going to come from politicians. Even if you have so-called independent regulators, politicians will only be doing that if they think they have a mandate from the electorate to do that. You're not going to get that unless you've motivated sufficient numbers to give them that mandate. In other words, to show sufficient interest amongst voters, so that any politician knows that if they're not doing something, then they're going to get voted out. Now, the problem is, it seems as though a lot of the motivation, that the most highly motivated groups are not necessarily those who want to engage in the mainstream political process. So, or indeed, maybe they can't engage because they're too young. So we've seen, at school level, we've obviously, with Greta Thunberg and so on, and I work with local schools quite a lot, high schools and so on. There's a very strong interest in sustainability issues, climate change. It's there, definitely, but they don't vote. These are 15, 16-year-olds. So it'll be another 3-4 years before they have the chance to vote. And during that time, the motivation may disappear. They may become disillusioned with the political process, particularly with politicians in the UK. So I think, yeah, motivation, I think, it really does need to come. Whether it comes first, well, possibly, but I think maybe there is now more of a consensus about the need to do something, whatever that is. And I think most politicians pick up on this. Regulation will, as I said, follow on from that. It's just, but again, it's the state intervening. And again, you're going to get different attitudes to the role of the state and the importance of the role of the state. And that again is politics. So I think it's as I said, it's a really interesting question, and it's not one I've actually thought about until you raised it and I started to waffle on here. And I think there are a lot of different aspects to it. And I think it may well be that it is about motivating students and then getting them to vote as well.
Yeah, definitely. Completely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. That was a really super interesting conversation and a great inspiring way to leave us with the need for us to motivate our students to engage on these topics.
Good luck with that. And as I said, it can be very disheartening if you're a young academic these days. I know that. Yeah. If you want to actually make a career in academic research in and around sustainability, particularly in an economics or finance department, yeah, I mean, I think you need to play the game a little bit, I'm afraid. It's not an easy route to go along, but it's an interesting route to go along, and maybe in 20 years' time, yeah, it's one that we'll all be, well, those who are still alive, we'll all be involved in.
Yeah. Well, we'll be doing that work together, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and hopefully, there was a few things there I said that might provoke some discussion or ideas. And Stephen knows I do like to provoke, so
it was good.
Thanks very much. Good.
Take care, Paul.
Okay. Enjoy. Shall I stop? I guess I've got to stop the recording now as well. Right.
Yeah.